in the unforgiving landscape of 1950s Arizona, where the ghosts of the Old West still whispered through canyon winds and justice was measured in gunpowder and lead, one man had laid down his guns for love. Blake Shelton, once feared across 3 territories as the fastest draw in the Southwest, had found something worth more than his deadly reputation, a woman who saw past his bloodstained past to the man he could become. But in a land where hatred runs as deep as ancient riverbeds, and some men believe might makes right, even the strongest love would be tested by fire and steel. When shadows from both past and present converge on the sacred ground of the Apache reservation, Blake must choose between the peace he's built and the violence that once defined him. Sometimes, the only way to protect what you love is to become what you've tried to leave behind. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red earth of the San Carlos Apache Reservation, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. Blake Shelton stood on the wooden porch of his modest adobe house, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching his wife Aminah tend to their small garden. At 6 months pregnant, she moved with the careful grace of someone carrying precious cargo, her long black hair braided with colored beads that caught the early light. "The corn is coming in well this year," she said, straightening with effort and placing a protective hand over her rounded belly. "My grandmother always said the earth provides when the heart is at peace." Blake nodded, though peace felt like a fragile thing in his calloused hands. 3 years had passed since he'd hung up his gun belt. 3 years since he'd traded the violent life of a hired gun for the quiet rhythms of reservation life. The transformation hadn't been easy. A man doesn't simply wash away 20 years of gunfighter's blood with good intentions and morning prayers. "Blake," Aminah's voice carried a note of concern as she approached the porch. "You have that look again, the one that sees trouble where there is none." He set down his coffee and wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the sage-scented sweetness of her hair. "Maybe I'm just getting old, darling. Too many years looking over my shoulder." "You're 38, not 80, she laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "And you haven't needed to look over your shoulder since we married. The tribal council trusts you. The children don't run when they see you coming anymore. You help with the horses. You've learned our ways." "Your ways," Blake corrected gently. "I'm still learning." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their morning peace. Blake's hand instinctively moved toward his hip, where his Colt .45 had once rested. Finding only empty space, he felt both relief and a strange vulnerability. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer, their faces grim under wide-brimmed hats. Charlie Redfeather, one of the tribal council members, dismounted with urgent haste. "Blake, we need to talk. It's about the Morrison gang." The name hit Blake like a physical blow. Jack Morrison, a man who'd made his fortune running cattle on disputed land and his reputation terrorizing anyone who challenged his claim to it. Blake had crossed paths with Morrison's crew twice in the past, both times ending in gunfire and bodies. "What about them?" Blake asked, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his veins. "They rode through the eastern border yesterday," Charlie said, his weathered face creased with worry. "Told the families living there they had 3 days to pack up and leave. Said the land was being claimed by white settlers under some new government decree." Aminah's hand tightened on Blake's arm. "They can't do that. The reservation boundaries were set by treaty." "Treaties are just paper to men like Morrison," Blake said quietly. "And paper burns real easy." Charlie nodded grimly. "They're coming back tomorrow. Word is they've got 30 men, maybe more. They're planning to make an example of anyone who refuses to leave." Blake felt the familiar weight of an old life pressing down on his shoulders. In the distance, children played between the adobe houses, their laughter carrying on the desert wind. Elder women sat in the shade, weaving baskets and sharing stories. Young men tended horses in the corral, their faces unmarked by the kind of violence Blake had once carried like a badge. "What does the council want to do?" he asked. "We've sent word to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but you know how long that takes," Charlie replied. "Some of the younger men want to fight, but we don't have the weapons or the numbers. Morrison's got rifles, and men who know how to use them. Blake looked at his wife, seeing the fear she was trying to hide behind her calm exterior. Their unborn child kicked, as if sensing the tension in the air. This was supposed to be their safe place, their sanctuary from the violent world that had almost consumed them both. "There might be another way," Blake said slowly. "Let me think on it." As Charlie and the other riders departed, Aminah turned to face her husband. "You are thinking about the guns, aren't you? The ones you buried behind the old oak tree." Blake couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm thinking about keeping you and our child safe." "And I'm thinking about keeping the man I married," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "The Blake Shelton who learned to plant corn and fix wagon wheels. The one who sits with the elders and listens to their stories. The one who promised me he was done with killing." "Some promises are harder to keep than others," Blake said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Blake walked to the edge of the reservation's eastern border. The land stretched endlessly toward the horizon, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree. This was Apache land, sacred ground where generations had lived, loved, and died. The thought of Morrison's men trampling across it, driving out families who had nowhere else to go, made his blood run cold. Behind him, the sounds of the reservation settling into evening, mothers calling children to dinner, the soft murmur of conversations in Apache, the distant lowing of cattle. It was a peaceful sound, the kind he'd never thought he'd be part of. But peace, he was learning, was something that had to be defended. When he returned to the house, Aminah was waiting on the porch, her hands folded over her belly. "What did you decide?" "I decided that some things are worth fighting for," Blake said, settling beside her on the wooden steps. "But maybe there's a way to fight without becoming what I used to be." "And what way is that?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds of the desert. "I don't know yet, but I've got until tomorrow to figure it out." The next morning brought clouds that promised rain, but delivered only oppressive heat. Blake found himself standing before the old oak tree behind their house, a shovel in his hands and sweat beading on his forehead. The metal box he'd buried 3 years ago lay open at his feet, revealing the tools of his former trade. A Colt .45 peacemaker, its wooden grip worn smooth by years of use, and a gun belt that had once been as familiar as his own skin. "I thought I might find you here." Blake turned to see Tom Bearcloud, the eldest member of the tribal council, approaching with slow, measured steps. The old man's face was a map of weathered lines, each one telling a story of survival in a harsh land. "Tom," Blake nodded, making no move to hide the weapons. "Come to talk me out of it?" "Come to talk, yes. Out of it." Tom shrugged, settling his considerable frame against the oak tree. "That depends on what it is." Blake hefted the gun belt, feeling its familiar weight. "You know what this is. What I was." "I know you were a man who killed for money," Tom said matter-of-factly. "I also know you're a man who's learned to live for love. Question is, which man are you today?" "I'm a man whose wife and unborn child are in danger." "And you think that gun is the answer?" Blake holstered the Colt, muscle memory guiding his movements. "I think it's the only language Morrison understands." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Blake's face. "You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about the old days, when the Apache fought the cavalry. He said the greatest warriors weren't the ones who killed the most enemies. They were the ones who knew when to fight and when to find another way." "And what way is that, Tom? Morrison's got 30 men with rifles. What do we have?" "We have something he doesn't," Tom replied. "We have the right to be here. And we have you, a man who knows how his mind works." Blake frowned. "What do you mean?" "You were a hired gun, Blake. You know how men like Morrison think, how they operate. Maybe that knowledge is worth more than your speed with a pistol." Before Blake could respond, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the reservation. Through the shimmering heat, they could see riders approaching, a long line of men on horseback, led by a figure Blake recognized even at a distance. Jack Morrison rode like a man who owned the world, his back straight and his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. "Looks like thinking time is over," Tom observed. Blake and Tom made their way to the center of the reservation, where a crowd had already gathered. Women clutched their children close, while men stood in small groups, their faces grim. Aminah was there, her hand protectively over her belly, flanked by other women from the community. Morrison's gang rode to a stop about 50 yards away, their horses snorting and pawing the ground. The leader himself was a tall man with silver hair and pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He'd grown older since Blake had last seen him, but the cruel intelligence in his gaze remained unchanged. "Well, well," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Blake Shelton, I heard you'd gone soft, but I didn't believe it until now." Blake stepped forward, his hand hovering near his gun. "Morrison, still stealing land from folks who can't fight back?" "Not stealing, boy. Claiming. The government's decided this land would be better used for cattle ranching and farming. These people are being relocated to a reservation in Oklahoma." "This is a reservation," Blake replied evenly, "protected by federal treaty." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Treaties get broken all the time, especially when there's money to be made." Charlie Redfeather stepped up beside Blake. "We've sent word to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They'll be here within the week." "A week's a long time," Morrison said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "A lot can happen in a week. Fires, stampedes, unfortunate accidents. You'd be surprised how dangerous it can be for folks who don't know when to move along." Blake felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had made him deadly with a gun. But something else held him back, the memory of Aminah's words, the weight of the life they'd built together. "What do you want, Morrison?" he asked. "I want you to convince these people to leave peacefully. Tonight, pack up their belongings and head east. Do that, and nobody gets hurt." "And if we refuse?" Morrison's smile widened. "Then I guess we'll find out if you're as fast as you used to be." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Blake could feel the eyes of the entire community on him, waiting to see what he would do. Part of him, the part that had lived by violence for so many years, wanted to accept the challenge, to settle this the way he'd settled so many conflicts before. But another part of him, the part that had learned to love and be loved, knew that drawing his gun would make him exactly what Morrison wanted him to be. A killer, not a protector. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," Blake said finally. "At noon." Morrison's eyes glittered with anticipation. "Looking forward to it, Blake. Real looking forward to it." As the gang rode away, kicking up clouds of dust, Blake felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Aminah beside him, her face pale but determined. "Whatever you're planning," she said quietly, "remember that our child needs a father, not a legend." That night, Blake sat alone on his porch, the weight of his gun belt heavy across his lap. The reservation was quiet, but he could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. In the distance, the lights of Morrison's camp flickered like malevolent stars. Tom Bearcloud emerged from the darkness, moving with surprising stealth for a man his age. "Can't sleep either?" "Too much thinking to do," Blake replied. "You know, I've been thinking too. About what you said earlier, about Morrison having 30 men with rifles." "What about it?" Tom settled into the chair beside him. "You ever wonder why a man needs 30 guns to run off a dozen families? Seems like overkill to me." Blake frowned. "What are you getting at?" "Maybe Morrison's not as confident as he pretends. Maybe he's got his own reasons for wanting this settled quick and quiet." "Such as?" Tom smiled, his weathered face creasing. "Such as maybe those government papers of his aren't as legal as he claims. Maybe he's got a deadline of his own to meet." Blake sat forward, his mind racing. "You think he's running a bluff?" "I think 30 men cost a lot of money to hire. And I think a man like Morrison doesn't spend money. He doesn't have to unless he's got no choice." For the first time in days, Blake felt something other than dread. "Tom, you might be onto something." "Course I am. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Blake stood, his hand moving to his gun belt, but instead of drawing the weapon, he unbuckled it and set it aside. "I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning. I'm going to think like Blake Shelton the man, not Blake Shelton the gunfighter. And what does Blake Shelton the man think? Blake looked out across the reservation, at the homes and lives that Morrison threatened to destroy. He thinks it's time to call Morrison's bluff. Dawn broke gray and overcast, the promised rain finally beginning to fall in a light drizzle that turned the desert dust to mud. Blake stood in the tribal council meeting house, surrounded by the community leaders and a handful of the reservation's younger men. Maps were spread across the wooden table, showing the boundaries of the reservation and the surrounding territory. "Here's what I think is happening," Blake said, pointing to a section of the map. "Morrison's not just after our land. He's after the water rights that come with it." Charlie Redfeather leaned forward. The spring, Blake confirmed. "It's the only reliable water source for 50 miles in any direction. Without it, the land Morrison's already claimed is worthless for cattle ranching." Tom Bearcloud nodded slowly. "And if he can drive us off, he can claim the water rights went with the land." "Exactly. But here's the thing. He's got to make it look legal. If he just massacres us, the federal government will have to investigate. Bad publicity, too many questions. But if we voluntarily relocate, the water rights transfer quietly," Charlie finished. "No one asks questions about a bunch of Indians who decided to move on." Blake pointed to another section of the map. "I rode out last night, did some scouting. Morrison's got his men camped in 3 groups, 10 men at the eastern approach, 10 at the southern, and 10 with him at the main camp. Standard military formation for controlling territory." "So what are you proposing?" asked Sarah Whitehorse, one of the tribal council members. Blake straightened, his decision made. "I'm proposing we don't give him what he wants. We don't fight him on his terms, and we don't run away. We make him show his hand." "How?" "By calling his bluff. If Morrison's papers are legitimate, why hasn't he presented them to the tribal council? Why the threats and intimidation instead of going through proper legal channels?" Tom smiled grimly. "Because he can't afford to wait for legal channels." "Right. I think Morrison's got a deadline. Maybe investors breathing down his neck. Maybe debts coming due. He needs this land deal to go through fast, or he loses everything." Charlie stood up, pacing to the window. "So what do we do? Just sit here and wait?" "No," Blake said. "We make him come to us. On our terms." The plan Blake outlined was simple but risky. Instead of confronting Morrison at high noon like some dime novel gunfight, they would force him to negotiate. If his claim to the land was legitimate, he could present his papers to the tribal council and the Bureau of Indian Affairs representative who was already en route. If he refused, it would prove he was running a bluff. "And if he decides to just burn us out anyway?" Sarah asked. Blake's hand moved unconsciously to his gun. "Then we'll be ready." As the council meeting broke up, Blake found himself walking toward his house, lost in thought. The plan was sound, but it depended on Morrison being the kind of man who would back down when faced with exposure. Blake had known plenty of men who would rather fight than lose face, even when the fight was unwinnable. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world," Aminah said as he approached their porch. She was sitting in her rocking chair, mending one of his shirts. "Maybe I am," Blake replied, settling beside her. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm carrying our child and worrying about his father," she said, her needle flashing in the gray light. "The women have been talking. They're scared, Blake. Not just of Morrison's men, but of what might happen to their families if this goes bad." Blake nodded. "I know. I'm scared too. You, the fastest gun in 3 territories. Being fast with a gun doesn't make you fearless, darling. It just makes you dangerous. And dangerous men have a way of bringing danger to everyone around them." Aminah set down her sewing and took his hand. "Then why are you doing this? Why not just strap on your gun and face Morrison the way you would have 3 years ago?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain create small rivers in the dust. "Because 3 years ago, I was a man who solved problems with bullets. Now I'm a man who's learned there might be better ways." "And if there aren't?" Blake's jaw tightened. "Then I'll do what I have to do to protect my family." The hours passed slowly, marked by the steady patter of rain on the roof. As noon approached, Blake found himself standing once again before the old oak tree, his gun belt in his hands. But this time, instead of strapping it on, he wrapped it carefully in oilcloth and returned it to its metal box. "You sure about this?" Tom Bearcloud asked, appearing beside him. "No," Blake admitted, "but I'm sure about what happens if I strap on that gun. I become the man I used to be, and that man leaves a trail of bodies wherever he goes." Tom nodded. "The council's ready. Morrison's approaching with his full force, all 30 men. Blake took a deep breath, feeling the absence of his gun like a missing limb. "Then let's go see what kind of man Jack Morrison really is." The confrontation took place in the center of the reservation, just as Blake had planned. Morrison rode up with his entire gang, their weapons clearly visible, their faces grim with anticipation. But instead of finding Blake alone and armed for a gunfight, they found him standing with the entire tribal council, surrounded by the community's families. "Where's your iron, Blake?" Morrison called out, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Don't need it," Blake replied. "We're here to talk, not shoot." Morrison laughed, but it sounded forced. "Talk? Boy, I told you what I wanted. These people gone by sunset, or we start shooting." "And I told you we'd give you an answer at noon," Blake said calmly. "Here's our answer. Show us your papers." "My what?" "Your legal claim to this land. The government decree you mentioned. Show it to the tribal council, and we'll consider your request." Morrison's face darkened. "I don't have to show you nothing." "Actually, you do," Blake said, "because the Bureau of Indian Affairs representative is about 2 hours out, and when he gets here, he's going to want to see those papers too, along with documentation of your authority to negotiate land transfers on behalf of the federal government." For the first time, Morrison looked uncertain. His hand moved to his gun, but he didn't draw it. "You're stalling." "I'm following the law," Blake replied, "something you seem to have forgotten how to do." The standoff stretched out, tension crackling in the air like electricity. Morrison's men shifted restlessly in their saddles, clearly expecting violence, but finding only calm determination. Blake could see the calculation in Morrison's eyes, the weighing of options, the assessment of risks. Finally, Morrison spoke. "You've got until sundown to reconsider. After that, we do this the hard way." As Morrison and his men rode away, Blake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The bluff had worked, but it had also raised the stakes. Morrison would be back, and next time, he might not be interested in talking. "You think that bought us enough time?" Charlie asked. Blake watched the dust cloud kicked up by Morrison's retreat. "I think it bought us enough time to find out what we're really dealing with." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Blake sat on his porch cleaning his rifle. Not the Colt .45 of his gunfighter days, but a simple hunting rifle he used for putting food on the table. Aminah sat beside him, her hands folded over her belly. "The baby's been kicking all day," she said softly. "I think he knows something's happening." "Maybe he's just eager to see the world," Blake replied, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Or maybe he's warning us," Aminah said. "Blake, what if Morrison comes back tonight? What if he decides talking is over?" Blake set down his rifle and took her hand. "Then we'll be ready. Not the way I used to be ready, but ready all the same." In the distance, the lights of Morrison's camp flickered like warning beacons. The final confrontation was coming, and Blake knew that all his careful planning might not be enough to prevent bloodshed. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was fighting for something worth dying for. Not just his own reputation or another man's money, but the future of the people he'd come to love. The question was whether love would be enough to overcome the violence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The attack came just before dawn, when the sky was still dark and the desert air held the chill of night. Blake had been expecting it. Morrison wasn't the type to wait around for federal investigators, but the sound of gunfire still sent ice through his veins. He rolled out of bed, grabbing his rifle and checking the loads. Beside him, Aminah struggled to sit up, her face pale with fear. "Stay down," Blake whispered, helping her to the floor beside their bed. "Keep low and stay away from the windows." Outside, the sounds of battle echoed across the reservation. Men shouting, horses neighing, the sharp crack of rifles punctuating the chaos. Blake could see muzzle flashes through the window, scattered throughout the settlement like deadly fireflies. Blake! Aminah grabbed his arm as he started toward the door. Don't go out there. Please. I have to, he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The others need help. Then take it, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. Take the gun. Blake paused at the door, his hand on the handle. The Colt .45 lay in its box beneath the floorboards, waiting. All he had to do was strap it on, and he'd be the man he used to be. Fast, deadly, feared. But he'd also be the man who'd chosen violence over every other option. No, he said finally. That's not who I am anymore. Blake slipped out of the house, rifle in hand, and immediately saw the scope of Morrison's assault. The gang had surrounded the reservation, attacking from multiple directions to prevent any coordinated defense. Families huddled in their homes, while the reservation's few armed men tried to hold them off. Blake made his way toward the center of the settlement, using the adobe buildings for cover. He could see Tom Bearcloud and several others barricaded behind an overturned wagon, returning fire at Morrison's men. Charlie Redfeather was defending the tribal council building with two younger men, their ammunition clearly running low. The tactical situation was hopeless. Morrison had superior numbers, better weapons, and the advantage of surprise. In a straight firefight, the reservation's defenders would be overwhelmed within the hour. But Blake had learned something during his 3 years of peace. Sometimes the best way to win a fight was to change the rules. He worked his way to the eastern edge of the settlement, where Morrison had positioned his largest force. 10 men with rifles, spread out in a defensive line, pouring fire into the reservation while staying safely out of range of return shots. Blake studied their position, his mind working like it had in the old days, when he'd been hired to solve problems that couldn't be solved with law or reason. These men were professionals, but they were also mercenaries. They fought for money, not conviction. Moving carefully, Blake circled around behind their position. The rain had softened the ground, muffling his footsteps as he approached the group's leader, a thick-set man with a scarred face, who was directing the assault. "You boys making good money today?" Blake asked, pressing the barrel of his rifle against the man's neck. The scarred man froze, his finger tightening on his trigger. "Blake Shelton. Heard you'd gone soft." "Soft enough to walk up behind you without you noticing," Blake replied. "Now, you can keep shooting at those folks, or you can listen to what I have to say." "I'm listening. Morrison's not paying you to win a war. He's paying you to scare some Indians off their land. Question is, how much is he paying you to die for it?" The scarred man was quiet for a moment, considering. "What are you offering?" "I'm offering you the chance to ride away. No harm, no foul. Tell Morrison you ran into more resistance than expected." "And if we don't?" Blake's voice hardened. "Then you'll find out why they used to call me the fastest gun in 3 territories. Your choice." The standoff lasted nearly a minute, long enough for Blake to wonder if he'd made a fatal mistake. Then the scarred man lowered his rifle and whistled to his men. "Mount up," he called. "We're pulling back." "What about Morrison?" one of his men asked. "Morrison can fight his own battles. I ain't dying for his water rights." As the eastern group rode away, Blake felt a surge of hope. If he could turn enough of Morrison's men, maybe this could end without a massacre. But that hope died as he saw flames rising from the southern edge of the reservation. Morrison had changed tactics. If he couldn't drive the Apache off with gunfire, he'd burn them out. Blake ran toward the flames, his heart pounding. The fire was spreading quickly, jumping from building to building in the dry desert air. Families were fleeing their homes, carrying what possessions they could salvage. And in the center of it all, directing the destruction, was Jack Morrison himself. "Blake," Morrison called out when he saw him approaching. "Come to watch your new family burn. Come to give you one last chance to walk away." Blake replied, his rifle trained on Morrison's chest. Morrison laughed, his pale eyes reflecting the flames. "Walk away? Boy, I've got 20 years and a fortune invested in this land deal. You think I'm going to let some half-breed squaw and her gunslinger husband stop me?" The words hit Blake like a physical blow. The rage he'd been holding back for 3 years suddenly blazed hotter than the fires consuming the reservation. "You shouldn't have said that," Blake said quietly. "What are you going to do about it?" Morrison sneered. "Shoot me with that hunting rifle? You're not the man you used to be, Blake. You've gone soft." Blake looked around at the burning buildings, at the families fleeing for their lives, at the community he'd helped build being destroyed by one man's greed. Morrison was right. He wasn't the man he used to be. He was something more. "You're right," Blake said, lowering his rifle. "I'm not the man I used to be." Morrison's smile widened, finally showing some sense. The sentence was cut off as Blake's fist connected with Morrison's jaw, sending the older man sprawling in the dirt. Blake was on him in an instant, his hands around Morrison's throat. "I used to be a man who killed for money," Blake snarled. "Now I'm a man who fights for family." Morrison clawed at Blake's hands, gasping for air. Around them, the battle continued, but Blake was aware only of the man beneath him, the man who'd threatened his wife, his unborn child, his community. "Blake," the voice cut through his rage like a knife. He looked up to see Aminah approaching, her face streaked with tears and soot from the fires. "Blake, don't," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't who you are." "He threatened our family," Blake said, his hand still around Morrison's throat. "Our child. And killing him won't change that," Aminah replied. "It'll only make you the man you used to be." Blake looked down at Morrison, seeing the fear in the older man's eyes. It would be so easy to squeeze just a little harder, to end this threat once and for all. But Aminah was right. Taking that step would undo everything he'd built, everything he'd learned. Slowly, Blake released his grip and stood up. Morrison gasped and rolled away, his hand moving toward his gun. "I wouldn't," Blake said calmly. "My wife just saved your life. Don't make me regret listening to her." Morrison's hand stopped, hovering over his weapon. "This isn't over, Blake." "Yeah, it is," Blake replied, "because in about an hour, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to arrive, and they're going to want to know why you've been burning down a federal reservation without proper authority. And I'm betting those papers you've been waving around won't stand up to close scrutiny." Morrison's face went pale. "You're bluffing." "Am I? You want to bet your freedom on it." For a long moment, Morrison stared at Blake, calculating his options. Then, slowly, he got to his feet and whistled for his remaining men. "Mount up," he called. "We're done here." "What about the contract?" one of his men asked. "There's no contract," Morrison said bitterly. "There never was." As Morrison and his gang rode away, Blake felt Aminah's arms wrap around him from behind. Around them, the fires were being brought under control, and the sounds of battle were fading. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," Blake confirmed, turning to hold her close. "We won." "How can you be sure?" Blake smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Because we didn't become what they expected us to become. We didn't let them turn us into something we're not." 3 hours later, as the sun rose over the reservation, Blake stood on his porch holding his newborn son. The baby had decided to make his entrance into the world in the middle of the crisis, as if he couldn't wait to be part of the community that had fought so hard to protect him. "What are you going to name him?" Tom Bearcloud asked, settling into the chair beside Blake. Blake looked down at his son's tiny face, seeing Aminah's eyes and his own stubborn chin. "I was thinking Samuel," he said, "after my grandfather. He was a good man who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard." "Samuel Shelton," Tom mused, "has a nice ring to it." In the distance, the Bureau of Indian Affairs representative was documenting the damage and taking statements from witnesses. Morrison's bluff had been called, and the investigation would likely result in federal charges. The reservation was safe, the families were rebuilding, and Blake's son would grow up in a place where love was stronger than violence. "You know," Tom said, "I think your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become." Blake nodded, feeling the truth of it in his bones. He'd hung up his guns not because he was afraid to use them, but because he'd found something worth more than his reputation as a killer. He'd found a family, a community, and a chance to be the man he'd always had the potential to become. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Blake Shelton, husband, father, and defender of his people, looked out over the land he'd helped protect and knew that some battles were worth fighting, even if you had to change the rules to win them. The age of the gunfighter was ending, but the age of the protector had just begun. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.